In this lecture, we consider the is-ought gap. Consider the following argument. Particular human activity is precipitating the next mass extinction. Therefore, humans ought not do that particular activity. Now, this is being presented as an argument, so let's consider whether it's a good argument. Let's take the first claim to be a premise and the second claim to be a conclusion. If we did believe the premise, particular human activity is precipitating the next mass extinction, then ought we believe the conclusion? Now, let's set aside whether the premise is true. We'll be considering that in other parts of this unit, and that's not my area of expertise. But for argument's sake, for the purpose of this lecture, let's assume that the premise is true, that particular human activity is precipitating the next mass extinction. Are we rationally obliged to believe the conclusion? Therefore, humans ought not do that particular activity. Well, as it happens, with the information we've been provided so far, no, we're not required to believe the conclusion. And let's consider that for a moment. As it stands, it's not a good argument. There's something missing. So let's think about what's going on in between the premise and the conclusion, such that it's not a good argument as it currently stands. Well, the first thing to point out is that there's an is in the premise and an ought in the conclusion, but no ought in the premise. So is refers to a matter of fact, claiming something is the case, but an ought is an instruction. It's telling us what we ought to do or should do. So how do we make sense of the presence of that ought in the conclusion? How do we get from an is to an ought? Well, as it happens, we can provide two further premises to consider. Let's go through the argument in total again. Particular human activity is precipitating the next mass extinction. It is wrong to precipitate the next mass extinction. Humans ought not do that which is wrong. Therefore, humans ought not do that particular activity. So now we have a valid argument. Remember that valid arguments mean the structure of the argument is good, but that still leaves the question of whether the premises are true. If the premises are true in a valid argument, then it's a sound argument and we are rationally obliged to believe the conclusion. But there's a lot going on in these premises. Consider the word wrong. In what sense are we using this word? There are a number of different ways you might understand the word wrong. So we need to understand what we mean exactly by the word wrong. Furthermore, once we understand what we mean by the word wrong, is the premise true? Is it true that it's wrong to precipitate the next mass extinction? So notice there's a number of things we need to consider. Wrong, again, is a complex word. It might be interpreted simply as a subjective preference. The person articulating the claim has a subjective preference not to precipitate the next mass extinction, and they choose to describe that by saying it's wrong, when in fact all they're referring to is a subjective preference. If that's the case, you might simply ignore them. But on the other hand, if they're talking about some objective truth when they say it's wrong to precipitate the next mass extinction, then you might want to take that much more seriously if there's some objective truth about the wrongness. Notice that often we think in terms of moral truths in that way. Many people think moral truths have an objectivity that needs to be taken seriously. So, on the one hand, it might be a subjective preference. On the other hand, it might be an objective truth that this word wrong is referring to. And so we need to sort that out before we know how seriously to take this premise. And finally, we can distinguish instrumental from intrinsic wrongness. Something might be wrong just because it frustrates something else that you want to do. So that is an instrumental issue. If you didn't want to do the thing in question, then this might not be wrong anymore. So notice wrong might just be wrong in reference to something else you want. If you give up wanting that other thing, then this is no longer wrong. So there's an instrumental sense in which we can understand the word wrong, or an intrinsic sense. It might just be in and of itself a wrong thing to do. So there are a number of ways to understand the term wrong, and in order to understand whether we take the conclusion of this argument seriously, we need to understand how that word is being used, and we'll spend some time doing that in this unit. Now consider a different argument that brings out some other issues. Particular human activity is precipitating the next mass extinction. I don't want humans to precipitate the next mass extinction. Humans ought not do that which I don't want. Therefore, humans ought not do that particular activity. Now again, this is a valid argument. The structure is a good structure. But you might not be convinced by it. And you might not be convinced by it because you might not agree with one of the premises. For instance, humans ought not do that which I don't want. Notice how it makes clear that this is about a subjective preference. Someone is talking, someone is making this argument and saying, I just don't want humans to do that. Now, that would not carry much weight if it was a particular human who had no particular expertise. But what if the I in question is arguing for your best interest? Perhaps if you get to know something about the I who's arguing, you might have a different attitude about whether you should believe the conclusion or not. Consider some possibilities. If a subjectively self-interested person is the I in question, and you don't happen to agree with them, then you may not be particularly convinced by this argument. On the other hand, if the I that's arguing is an ideally rational person, even you might imagine yourself as an ideally rational person. Then, if it's an ideally rational person arguing, you might start to think seriously about the conclusion. Or, if it's a God that has your best interest at heart, then you might also take the argument seriously. So notice, although the argument, when first presented, didn't seem very strong at all because it seemed like a individual arguing and just saying, well, this is what I want. Once we start to think about who might provide such an argument, an ideally rational person, say, you might then take it more seriously. So notice, there's a lot going on between the premise particular human activity is precipitating the next mass extinction and the conclusion, therefore humans ought not do that particular activity. And we need to unpack what's going on between that premise and the conclusion. We also need to consider whether all of the premises are true or not. So once we've established what the premises are, we can ask whether the argument is valid, and then we can consider whether the premises are true, because a valid argument with true premises is a sound argument, and rationality requires that we accept the conclusion.